What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's reaction video is what if the US invades Russia day by day. Obviously at the moment there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. We're not going to get into that. We tried to stay away from that kind of stuff on the channel, so ignore what's going on for the purposes of the way we're speaking, and it will be interesting to see. We've done videos of what if, I think, Russia and China and all that tried to invade the US homeland a long time ago, and it pretty much was impossible. You've got 300 million people, enough guns for everyone in theory. A lot of people are trained. You ain't invading the US. No. Be interested to see if it's possible for the US to invade Russia. Obviously, I doubt it'd ever happen, because I think if it did, then it'd start a nuclear war or whatever, so this is highly unlikely. But it's such a big, vast place.
I think they could.
I don't know, you know. I get what you mean. They do have a lot of technology.
It says what if they did, so they obviously could, technically.
Well, anyone can. I could invade Russia, but I could get killed straight away. No, but you know what I mean? Anyone technically could try, but it doesn't mean they're successful. But it's so big. There is also a lot of people in Russia.
And I feel like invading on your home turf is different to you invading somebody else. So obviously, like, we've found out that they couldn't invade the USA. We kind of got that message, didn't we?
Russia and
but
China couldn't,
would the USA be able to back themselves up as much as they could on their homeland? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, definitely not, because you wouldn't have...
Like, this is what I mean. So maybe they couldn't invade Russia. Maybe it might not be successful because Russia are on their home turf this time.
Yeah, that...
I mean?
Oh, 100%. If it was on neutral ground and they're both trying to take somewhere, the US wins 10 times out of 10, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. But it's the fact that you've got all these people stationed here, you're having to come to them. Yeah. Like with the US one, you've got 300 million people who can use guns, and you're trying to invade them, whereas you probably only have a few million, I don't know what the numbers will be, but a few million people go into a country to do it, so you've lost 298 million. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's completely different. So
let's leave it to the experts.
Let's find out. Let us know your opinions in the comments below. And are you ready?
I'm ready.
Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button. Let's check out what if the US invades Russia. What we got?
Day 1. The plan to invade Russia had been in motion for 3 months, with massive amounts of men and material moved into staging areas around Europe and Japan. The powder keg everyone feared would be lit was about to explode. It all began with Lithuania blocking rail shipments from Russia to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, in protest over the war in Ukraine, effectively cutting it off from resupply. For weeks, Russia blustered and threatened, and then did the unthinkable. Russian troops crossed the border into Lithuania to seize and secure the railways, linking the critically important Kaliningrad with the motherland. NATO immediately activated its rapid response force, pushing Russian troops out of Lithuania. Now the United States is preparing to do the unthinkable, and something that's very likely to trigger nuclear war. It will invade Russia. U.S. troops have been staging in Poland, Norway, and Japan. The obvious choice may be one of the Baltic nations, but port facilities and airfields here are too close to Russia and under the threat of constant attack. At 0 hour, the American attack begins on Russia. It starts with a series of explosions along the western air defense perimeter Russia's established on its home soil to defend against NATO air attack. It's an extremely robust system of SAM satellites, fighter bases, and radar installations, the densest air defense network in the world. But the United States has several tools for the job. The first is the B-2 stealth bomber. With its lack of vertical surfaces, it's the only stealth aircraft in the world that can also defeat long-range tracking radar, which even the best stealth fighter is vulnerable to. The only clue to the incoming attack are intermittent anomalous pings on Russian radars. But by the time Russian fighters arrive to investigate, the B-2s are long gone. Radar and communication nodes are the first to be targeted by American B-2 stealth fleet. This knocks out a significant amount of Russian long-range radar, and a few hours later, B-51 bombers armed with standoff attack munitions fire volleys of missiles to crater Russian airfields and destroy fixed SAM sites. Unlike Russia's attempts to knock out Ukraine's air defense network at the start of the war, this is a concentrated and well-coordinated attack, reminiscent of the shock and awe of the first Desert Storm, when the US and allies destroyed the second-best and most importantly Soviet-built air defense network in the world in hours.
That was definitely shots fired.
Move in to finish the job and knock out air bases along Russia's eastern border, as well as destroy rail infrastructure. Russia's mobility depends disproportionately heavily on railways, hence its problems inside Ukraine. And crippling railways means Russia can't move troops and equipment until the rails are repaired. F-35s are nowhere near as stealthy as the B-2s and have to get much closer than the B-52s to launch their own attacks. But as Russian interceptors rise to meet them, they're greeted by a swarm of U.S. Air Force F-22s, which swat Russian fighters out of the sky from beyond visual range. The US loses several F-35s and fourth-generation aircraft in the attacks, but Russia's ability to defend its western border from air attack is crippled. There are still many mobile radars and SAM units to deal with, but these are under dire threat from constant wild weasel attacks by the US Air Force. Once feared as a near-peer competitor to the US, the war in Ukraine has proven that the Russian Air Force is not even capable of neutralizing a much weaker country such as Ukraine. Poor training, lack of communication, antiquated tactics, and bad maintenance all add up to devastating losses for Russia's air forces.
No matter how many people
Even
you got.
as the US airstrikes begin, American ground forces are already rumbling to battle. Abrams main battle tanks and Apache attack helicopters smash into Russian defensive lines in Kaliningrad. With overwhelming air support, the battles are brutal but short. Russian armor is no match for modern American weapons, and its tank forces are so depleted by the fighting in Ukraine that modern Russian tanks are few and far between. As Desert Storm proved, Cold War Soviet tanks are no match for even early model M1 Abrams.
Oh, wow.
Especially not
Yeah,
when
they
working
no
in
chance at the
conjunction with
moment.
close air
They're
support
getting absolutely
aircraft
battered.
like the Apache or the A-10 Warthog. By the end of the first day of the battle, Russian ground forces have suffered their worst defeat since the opening day of Operation Barbarossa. Day 3. U.S. forces have moved deep inside Ukraine, where they're en route to reinforce Ukrainian units in the east of the country. Under intense air assault, Russian forces have been retreating across the entire eastern front of the war. Ukrainian troops have used overwhelming American air power to inflict devastating losses on retreating Russians, and American ground forces are having to rush to catch up with them. There is fear of overextension, but the constant U.S. air and missile assault leaves little room or time for the Russians to counterattack. The key to America's deadly efficiency is information. The U.S. military is the most networked military in the world, and unlike Russia, employs overwhelming amounts of smart weapons. It's been tracking Russian forces since the start of the war in Ukraine, and sharing that information with Ukraine to devastating effect. However, the Ukrainian army always lacked the hardware to make full use of the information. The U.S. doesn't. Adding to Russia's woes is a fundamental lack of operational...
That's the advantage of spending all that money.
It is, unfortunately.
When we've done all these videos...
For the other person, unfortunately.
Yeah, for the other person. Not unfortunately for
Yeah.
us. Because again, we're friends, US. We're on the same side. Hopefully always.
Hopefully, unless Liz Truss comes in or something.
Does something wrong. But
she does something mad, I'm American. Okay?
yeah.
Don't come for me.
We'll just
She
come in.
does, she's not our leader.
Yeah, we're just coming over to you. we're with you. But yeah, the amount that's been pumped into it means we've got this modern technology, and it will do the job. But I'll tell you what, it's a lot more one-sided than I initially thought. I know, again, the US is such a massive powerhouse, but again, like you said, you go in someone else's turf. Is it going to be as one-sided?
Tricky one.
When they go in on the ground, will it be? We'll see, but it's a lot more one-sided than I thought so far.
security in its military, most of Russia's radios are unsecured, allowing the U.S. to scoop up vast amounts of signals intelligence. After spending 20 years hunting down terrorists in the Middle East by snooping through millions of radio and cell phone intercepts, the U.S. has gotten extremely good at the job. This is why in the real world, Russian generals have been dying on a regular basis, their location pinpointed by the U.S. and transmitted to Ukrainian forces. Now that the U.S. hardware is in play, the slaughter is exponentially greater. Russian command chains are broken across the Eastern Front, and its forces in general retreat to more fortified positions inside the cities of eastern Ukraine. Day 7. The battle for Kaliningrad is officially over. The fighting was brutal and intense, but under-equipped and demoralized Russian forces were ultimately overwhelmed by U.S. firepower. Psychological operations against Russian troops have been particularly effective. First is an overwhelming display of U.S. power in the form of precision air and long-range artillery strikes. Then radio broadcasts and even leaflets delivered by the U.S. Air Force promise amnesty for any Russian soldier who surrenders. With a large number of conscripts who are accustomed to poor, even abusive treatment, the psychological operation to demoralize Russian forces has been a great success. It doesn't help that many Russian forces here have been recently rotated out of the brutal fighting in Ukraine. If the Russian army could barely win against Ukraine, what hope does it have against the full might of the U.S. military?
It's a good point.
In the east of Ukraine, American ground forces have joined the fighting alongside their Ukrainian allies. The arrival of vast amounts of American firepower has reinvigorated Ukraine's frontline forces, who are eager to liberate captured territory. But Russia is an artillery army, meaning they field many times more artillery than any other military in the world. And despite intense counter-battery fire and use of ground attack aircraft, the U.S. is suffering its worst losses since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Day 14. The fighting in Kaliningrad is down to small guerrilla operations by Russian resistance forces. NATO forces from Spain, Germany, Poland, and Italy conduct anti-guerrilla operations, freeing up U.S. forces to continue pushing into the Baltics. Rather than invade the Baltic nations as it once was feared Russia would do in case of a war, the Russian army has chosen to strengthen its defenses along the Baltic border instead. A wise move given the Russian Air Force's inability to deter U.S. air operations. Without adequate air cover, any ground offensive against a military with the largest, most modern air force in the world is doomed to failure. Now
Yes,
U.S. forces
no
execute a push into Belarus from Lithuania and Poland. Belarusian resistance forces have been gathering inside Poland for weeks, undergoing training and being equipped by the U.S. military in anticipation of an operation to liberate their nation from dictator Lukashenko. A popular uprising against Lukashenko severely hampers loyalist forces' ability to repulse the invasion, and Russian forces sent in support are under intense and constant air attack. In Ukraine, the fighting has reached major occupied cities in the east, with Russian forces slowly but surely being expelled. However, urban combat is notoriously difficult and time-consuming, and heavily favors the defender. The U.S. is suffering its first major casualties in the fight to liberate East Ukraine. However, U.S. forces have been engaged in urban combat for 2 decades in the Middle East and have superior training and equipment. Cutting off supply lines to occupied cities also cripples the Russian resistance, as does morale issues which have reached critical levels. When they were fighting just...
I mean, as much the US is on top of that, it is sad because it comes down to both sides just losing loads of lives always, even the winning side, major casualties, which hopefully we don't get there. Obviously there's stuff going on at the moment, and hopefully in an ideal world everything would end and everyone would be happy. Obviously that's not an ideal world, but it is just sad because even when you're winning, there's still major casualties, isn't
People
it?
are still dying.
Still dying, still risking their life so we can potentially live free, because like you say, if it doesn't happen at times, stuff like that, we need them to fight for us to set us free. So huge respect, but it's so sad that they are dying. So it's sad either way, but the US are dominating, it seems like, and it just takes time.
I feel like I knew that.
Ukrainian forces armed with U.S. weapons, Russian frontline troops were already suffering from severe morale problems. Now faced with vengeful Ukrainians backed by American troops, morale is at a crisis point. Many units surrender without firing a shot. Day 21. A national mobilization effort across Russia has met with mixed success. With U.S. involvement in the Ukrainian war, the anti-war movement has picked up considerable steam. Many young Russians are refusing to show up when mobilized, and attacks on conscription offices are on the rise. The U.S. has fully mobilized its reserves as well, and behind closed doors at the highest levels of American power, discussions are being held on a new draft. While the U.S. completely outcompetes the Russian military, actually invading Russia and toppling the Putin regime will require many more combat forces than currently available, and the only way to generate the necessary manpower is a draft. Casualties are also mounting, and while the losses are heavily on the Russian side, the U.S. has suffered thousands injured and half that number dead. Of grave importance are losses in hardware. Modern U.S. manufacturing is poorly suited for mass replenishment of combat losses. With current U.S. defense production a fraction of what it was in the past, an invasion into Russia will cost huge amounts of hardware, and that is not going to be quickly replaced. U.S. industry can surge to building 28 Abrams a month, but if the U.S. is to maintain a credible deterrent against China, it'll need many times that number. Production of fighter aircraft is likewise limited, with perhaps 150 F-35s a year now being built. A surge might bring that number to 200. To put it simply, U.S. focus on advanced weapons and a reliance on overseas manufacturing means that American civilian manufacturing is poorly suited for a transition to wartime production of weapons.
That makes sense.
It's either going to have to win this war quickly or resort to less and less sophisticated weapons to do so. Day 30. At the end of the first month of fighting, Russian forces have been pushed back to within miles of Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. It's only stubborn resistance inside dense urban cities that's slowing U.S. forces down. Russia has learned not to engage the Americans or their Ukrainian allies in open country anymore. It's just inviting destruction either from the air or from smart precision artillery. A plan for an amphibious assault on the Kamchatka Peninsula is cancelled as fears over mounting losses of equipment have led to a redeployment of forces from Japan to the European theater. Instead, the U.S. Navy launches a number of raids against Russian military airfields and ports in the region, destroying the Russian Pacific Fleet completely. Russia's Far East, however, is relatively strategically unimportant to the nation, as it's too far from Russia's economic hubs to matter much. Thus, the losses do little to affect the war. The strategically important port of St. Petersburg has been blockaded since the start of the war, and the U.S. Navy launches periodic strikes against Russian forces in the city. Russia fears an amphibious assault incoming. and American Marines are spotted staging inside of Estonia for just such an operation. But it's a feint meant to draw Russian attention to the defense of the city and away from the fighting in Belarus. Inside Belarus, Lukashenko is a president in exile as U.S. and liberation forces free the capital city and march on a retreating loyalist force, hastily making for the Russian border. Under intense air attack, few of the forces make it to the border with any semblance of cohesion. Once at the border itself, they're met with betrayal. Much like Russia did in our real world to its separatist allies retreating inside Ukraine, the country now refuses to allow non-Russian forces to cross the border. Rather than fight, many surrender. Day 45. U.S. armor chases retreating Russian units across the Ukrainian border and into Russia itself. For the first time since World War II, Russia is now under invasion by a hostile foreign power. Along the Belarusian border, U.S. air and long-range artillery has been devastating Russian defensive positions in anticipation of an assault across the border. Precision strikes have targeted lines of communication, supply depots, and concentrations of heavy equipment. Russia has far more artillery than the U.S. and responds with overwhelming volleys of fire. However, the U.S. is better at counter-battery fire, and artillery duels tend to end with the U.S. on the winning side. U.S. air power has taken significant losses dismantling Russia's vast air defense network, but is still extremely capable and available in large numbers. It's this air power that's most lethal to Russia's artillery forces, who are under regular air attack. U.S. stockpiles of smart weapons have begun to run low, though, after a month and a half of intense combat operations. Dumb bombs are being upgraded with smart kits to make them weapon or GPS guided, and superior targeting capabilities by U.S. planes means that even dumb gravity bombs strike with great precision. By comparison, Russian smart weapon stockpiles are now completely depleted. Already running dangerously low by the 5th month of the war in Ukraine, Russia's stockpiles of modern weapons are all but exhausted. It's now putting Cold War relics into the fight with predictably poor results. But Russia has still a significant pool of manpower and conscripts to throw against the invading U.S. forces. As the invasion of Russia is set to formally begin, American commanders consider the dangerous logistics of going up against hundreds of thousands of Russian conscripts. Even if armed with vastly inferior equipment, the sheer number of defenders means U.S. forces could be overwhelmed if they overextend. The best strategy is to keep those troops from even fighting in the first place. U.S. PSYOPs have been working overtime to demoralize Russian troops and convince the Russian people to rise against the current regime. The U.S. promises that it has no intention of holding any seized Russian territory. In fact, it would be wildly impractical to do so, and instead states that its goal is the removal of the Putin regime. This message resonates with many disenfranchised Russians, especially amongst the younger generations. The crushing defeat suffered by Russian forces in the last 45 days helps steer many toward an unwillingness to fight. But many Russians see it as their duty to defend their homeland from any invader and have fierce loyalty to the Putin regime. A civil war is brewing inside Russia, and it might be the U.S.'s only hope of a successful invasion. Without support from the people, it's unlikely an attempt to remove Vladimir Putin from power will be successful. And that's if he doesn't resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Given the Russian military's incompetence, it's all but certain that the U.S. will also face the use of tactical nuclear weapons against its forces. This can only mean one thing: an equal retaliation by the United States. The dangerous climb up the nuclear ladder that only leads to one place: complete annihilation. Despite its vastly superior capabilities, even the U.S., sole superpower on Earth, simply cannot successfully invade Russia and defeat it without, in effect, defeating itself. Now go watch. Could the U.S. defend its homeland from a nuclear attack?
No one throw nukes, please. Really, that's just...
We need a world where nukes just disappear.
The thing is there's kind of no point in nukes because you end up killing yourself anyway.
Exactly, but I suppose...
what's the point? No one's going to know you won if everyone dies.
If you're mad enough and, if you're mad enough and brave enough, I guess. It's not the word, but you get what I mean. No one's even going to know that you've done it, because we'll all be dead. The will for that one couple minutes when it's on its way. It's like, it's over,
it's on its way.
Yeah, it takes a few... it's not going to be instant.
That is just horrible.
It's got to travel, hasn't it? So
I'm not checking the news ever.
You're just waiting. Smash that like button if you enjoyed it, guys. Smash the subscribe button. Again, hopefully there's no nuclear war. In an ideal world, no one will be fine, but unfortunately the world is not like that, and there is obviously... Do you know what? I found it very interesting, the fact they included the Ukraine war, so that wasn't factored in, so it actually factored in current events, which kind of meant you got more of an understanding of what would happen today. Now, I know you guys have your own opinions. You always let us know your own opinions, so please let us know what you think would actually happen, because there's going to be some bits in there where someone's going to think, no, it'd go either way, or something else would happen. So let us know in the comments your thoughts. Smash that like button, smash the subscribe button, and watch the video.
Have a fantastic day.
And we'll see you legends in the next one. Peace.